Welcome to Trifecta Collective, finding the root, where we dive deep into understanding and addressing root causes of chronic health issues so you can help and find healing inside and out, now and forever. Hello, and welcome to Trifecta Collective, Finding the Root. I'm Megan Abbott, owner and founder of the holistic health practice Trifecta Collective. Welcome to the podcast. So today I want to talk a little bit more of a technical kind of episode here and talk about the connection between mold, yeast, fungus, and parasite overgrowths. And I want to talk about symptoms of all of these, the connection that yeast, fungal, and parasite issues can have with mold, and a lot of the things that I see get wrong in this space when it comes to testing, when it comes to actually addressing any healing from these issues and healing from these things long term. Certainly, I'll talk about nutrition and supplementation and all those kinds of things as well here. And first, just want to start with the yeast and fungal piece of this, because we see a lot of people come in who maybe have done some testing. Maybe we see a lot of people who come in with rashes in particular, who have been to a dermatologist and they said the rash is fungal in nature, and they get a cream and the cream works. And then as soon as they stop the cream, it comes right back. And or maybe someone having recurrent UTIs, yeast infections, BV issues, these types of things that are often treated, whether in Western medicine and or in the functional medicine space, and not done very well because they're only looking at such a very small piece of the puzzle when it comes to this yeast and fungal overgrowth issues and how they can present. So let me start with some of the symptoms that are pretty common. And one thing I will say is, especially with yeast and fungal issues, and I typically refer to these things as yeast and fungal issues versus candida. And that is a version of yeast and fungal issues, just for reference. So they are similar things. Candida is not the only yeast and fungal issue that someone can have. And it is a very common one that you will hear. But I typically say yeast and fungal issues or overgrowth or something along those lines versus candida itself, because candida is a little bit more specific. And I want to talk a little bit more broad spectrum about these things. So, when we think about yeast and fungal overgrowth issues, first and foremost, people think of the gut, which of course, yeah, that is a common thing. The symptoms of candida, of yeast and fungal issues when it comes to the gut overlap so much, though, with many other things that can be present. Someone might have constipation issues with diarrhea, they might have gas, they might have bloating, food sensitivities. Those are all very, very common. I'll also say the other really big one is sugar cravings. And I'm talking ravenous kind of sugar cravings is very, very common, where it's almost like it takes over your brain and you're like, I need a piece of cake, I need a cupcake, I need ice cream now. And it's almost like your body's not satisfied until you get that, but then you usually don't feel good after it. The range of and severity of these symptoms can be really widespread, to occasional bloating, minor sugar cravings, to very extreme in nature. And once again, these are not exclusive yeast and fungal issues, and these are common with many people with yeast and fungal issues. So those are really common here. Often sometimes we will see things like the rashes, where someone will get a fungal type rash. And these rashes honestly can be just about anywhere on the body, ranging from face, neck, chest, arms, legs, feet, pretty widespread. So these kind of fungal issues are often pretty all over the place and pretty widespread if they're going to be there. A really telltale sign is if you have discoloration, especially yellowing in your toenails. That is almost always a yeast and fungal issue more than anything else. Same thing when it comes to dandruff, itchy scalp type issues. So we almost always see this being a yeast and fungal issue. Now, stress is a big driver of this, which can make all of it worse. So some seasonal changes sometimes will impact people. but most often true dandruff issues. And I'll say that's on your scalp. I've also worked with men who have gotten that in their beard, in their facial hair, and had a lot of issues there. And so that is not uncommon either, where we can see that not only in your scalp, but also in other types of facial hair, especially. Fatigue is very common and very widespread among many other things as well. We might see joint pain, muscle aches, muscle weakness. Once again, this is not exclusive to yeast and fungal issues. Headaches are pretty common. Some people with really extreme cases may even get almost like flu-like symptoms where they get fevers, they might get chills, things like that. That is a little bit more extreme and not as common. And often you are going to go see medical help, Western medical help, if this is a recurring issue. And they'll give you an antifungal medication. Hopefully that'll help. And we still, ideally, if, in our world, in the holistic health space, we're looking at the bigger picture and we're looking as to how and why did that happen versus just addressing the fact that these things are there and relevant. And sometimes for people, we need to do both. We need an immediate resolution if you are having extreme symptoms. And also, we want to look at the bigger picture and understand all of the pieces to the puzzle here. The other really big thing that we'll see is we'll say like mouth and throat kind of issues. These are a little bit more specific to yeast and fungal issues. However, there can be a little bit of overlap here, especially, some people will have really bad post-nasal drip, and you'll get a lot of mucus in your throat, or feel like you just have to clear your throat a lot. Usually that is yeast and fungal related. However, there can be a histamine component to this. And yes, there can be a connection to both of these things here. And sometimes that's not a yeast and fungal issue. Sometimes that is simply a histamine and or mast cell kind of reaction that the body is experiencing, and that is how it's presenting for you. But we have what's called oral thrush, and we will very, very commonly see this with yeast and fungal issues, where if you notice, especially first thing in the morning, you stick out your tongue and you've got that white coating on your tongue. And I'm not talking just a little bit, I'm talking like it is white, and you do like tongue scraping and you get some stuff. So a good amount of stuff coming off. That's really common. We may see mouth sores pretty commonly, and there is a difference. Like we'll usually see these inside the mouth versus something like a cold sore, which is going to be more viral in nature, and that's usually going to present more on the outside of the mouth and or right around the mouth versus on the inside of the mouth. We may also see see and or feel sores and cuts. This can be inside of your mouth. Oftentimes we'll see like white blistery kind of things and or white pus kind of stuff in someone's mouth. We also may see little cuts on the outside, especially in the corners, right along the corners of your mouth. That's pretty common as well. You also may get sores or cuts on your tongue as well. A little bit less common. Usually it's going to be somewhere within the mouth, especially on the cheeks, although I may see that on the top and bottom of your mouth as well. So those are often the most common symptoms. Sometimes we will also, we will get people who often see mucus or what's like a filmy kind of mucus coming out in their stool while they're not on any real supplements or anything. And that can be some yeast and fungal issues coming out, some yeast and fungus coming out of the body in the stool. Not as common, and I've certainly seen plenty of cases where that has been a thing. So those are really common. And I think it's important to understand here, and I am going to loop parasites in with this, although I am going to distinguish this again in just a couple minutes. But with these overgrowths, yeast and fungus, parasites, even bacteria, we're supposed to have these things in our body, and they are supposed to be there at certain amounts in certain places. And we're supposed to be asymptomatic because we have checks and balances when it comes to these things, especially in our gut of, hey, we have a symbiotic relationship with these things. A lot of these things are supposed to be in there and are beneficial to be in there at certain amounts in certain quantities and in specific places. The issue really comes into play when a lot of our checks and balances go out the window, and these things then become overgrown, meaning we have too much of them, and or they're in places where they're not supposed to be. So if we take yeast and fungus, for example, it's really supposed to be largely inside of our gut. Now, the issue comes into play when it's too much inside of our gut. Maybe it comes up too much and starts to come up into our esophagus, into our mouth, and we have a lot of those oral symptoms. It comes up and can start to impact our scalp and our hair. It starts to spread throughout our body, and we get the yeast and fungal rashes and or discoloration of the nails, things like that. And so it's just too much. The specific thing about yeast and fungus too is when it becomes overgrown, it starts to produce toxins. This is just what it does by its nature. So when it becomes overgrown and we have too much yeast and fungus within our body, oftentimes there is a toxin load piece that goes into this. However, now we have an additional piece where these yeast and fungal issues themselves are now producing extra toxins within our body that our liver largely, because that is our master filtration system, are a huge one, not the only one, and it's a huge piece of our drainage, just our overall drainage systems that we have. Our liver plays a really big role here. And if we have these overgrowth issues, and once again, we usually have some sort of toxin overload issue in the first place that is then contributing to these, now we have an additional toxin load piece. Our poor little livers just can really, really struggle to keep up. And it becomes a really big issue. So this is just a really big issue that many people face. And then, we'll often see, especially in women, we may see chronic issues when it comes to BV, bacterial vaginosis, UTI, so urinary tract type of issues. We also may see chronic yeast infections. Once again, this is the yeast and fungal issues traveling to places into our vaginal microbiome that they're not supposed to be at. These things are not supposed to be there. I've even seen quite a few cases of women who have no issues with, their vaginal microbiome unless they have sex. And the sex is really what is triggering, like all of a sudden every time they have sex, they have a yeast infection. They've got BV now, they've got a UTI. These things are not normal. This is not what is supposed to happen. Yeah, your partner may be playing a role here. They may have a yeast and fungal issue as well that may be then contributing and exacerbating yours. And I've healed so many women just themselves, and that issue just goes away because they're all of their microbiomes. When we think about our microbiomes, we really need to think about all three. We have our gut, which most people think about. We have our vaginal microbiome, and we have our oral microbiome, so in our mouth. And our oral health can play a really big role in this, but so do all three of these microbiomes really play off of each other. And if we've got an issue with one, the chances of it spreading to multiple goes up quite a bit. This is something that many people don't think about, especially if you've had root canals. It is really, really common for root canals to become infected and or already be infected at the time, even of a placement of a root canal. And I'm working on getting a holistic dentist on the podcast to chat a little bit more about this. I have some knowledge, and I feel like there are people who are a lot smarter in this particular area that are better suited than me to talk a little bit more in depth about a lot of this. But that's why we'll see, especially with yeast and fungal issues, traveling up, and we'll have all of these mouth issues. We may have vaginal issues because all of these microbiomes are so interconnected here. So that plays a really big role. So now we have this extra toxin load piece, and now our liver is even more stressed, and then let alone what else is going on within our body. We'll also tend to have nutrient deficiencies. We usually have some upper GI kind of issues. That might be low stomach acid. That might be issues with pancreatic enzymes, bioflow, and or a combination of all of that, which is quite common when it comes to these issues. Now, the reason I kind of loop parasites into this, because this is often how parasite issues come into play. And parasites, people think about, oh, I got a parasite from some sushi or some pork or some water or travel or all of these things. And yeah, absolutely, that can happen. I've seen it. I've worked with individuals who have gotten issues like that. And more common than not, that's not actually our parasite issue. The parasite issue, more often than not, is an overload issue, meaning, once again, everyone has parasites. We have them. They're supposed to be in certain places. They're supposed to be in certain amounts. We're not supposed to experience any negative side effects as a result of having them within our body. And when they become too much, when we have too many of them, and or once again, they travel to places that they're not supposed to be, with parasites in particular, big areas that I think about. So definitely the gut, reproductive organs, especially in women. If you've got any sort of like PCOS, endometriosis kind of issues, the chances that a parasite overload issue is playing a role is extremely, extremely high. I would say, in my experience, well over 90%. I actually feel pretty confident in saying 95% or above. So it's really, really high. And when we address the body systemically, specifically systemic parasites, which not all products also work systemic on parasites, by the way, which is a problem. This can wreak havoc on our hormones, and we can develop hormonal imbalances. Not saying those are the only root cause, that is the only root cause, and it can play a role for many, many, many women. We also might see lung issues, breathing issues. Man, the number of times I've taken people through systemic parasite work, and they can feel when they pass them oftentimes, and all of a sudden they have this experience of, man, I feel like I haven't been able to take a deep breath in forever, and all of a sudden I can feel my lungs expand. I can feel like I can take a big deep breath, and it feels really good. And that's often because there were parasites within the lungs, and that's not uncommon. We might see them in the sinuses. That's another really common place, especially for people with a lot of sinus issues, mold in particular, and mold colonization within the sinuses. It is super, super common to see all of these things in all of those places. So that's typically the bigger issue. And so the question is, once again, okay, well, if we have a parasite overload issue, how and why did this happen? Once again, toxins are often playing a role in this. Parasites love, love, love toxins, especially mold, especially heavy metals. They feed off of them, and when they feed off of them, they actually store these toxins within themselves. And when they die through their natural life cycle, so they go through natural life cycles, typically it's going to be anywhere between 7 to 21 days. That is the average. That is not exact, and that is a common lifespan for parasites within our body. So whether they're dying through natural life cycles and or through active killing protocols, maybe that we're doing, they're releasing that stuff back into the body. And this is why parasite cleanses, these Paragard, even let's throw in ivermectin here. They're largely not doing a good job because, one, are they just getting in the gut? In which case, parasites are not just in the gut. Two, all of these things are releasing toxins back into the body, and some pretty heavy hitters for some people, especially depending on what your toxin load is at that time that you're doing it. It's a lot of toxins being flooded back into your system, and you can get really sick. And are we including binders? Are we including what about liver support? Is our body able to handle throwing all of these toxins back into our body? Are we in a good enough spot where our body can handle it, convert these toxins into a form of waste so it can be pushed out of our body, whether it's through urine, stool, sweat. Those are the most common ones that we'll typically see here. And like, how do we get this stuff out of our body? And the same thing is, if you're constipated on top of that, man, that adds just another layer, because these things will die and then they get stuck in your body, and then your body's reabsorbing all of these toxins, and these things can get stuck and can cause even more symptoms and quite the variety of issues here. So this is really where my issue comes into play, in people doing random parasite cleanses and using random, whether that's medications and or supplementations for these things, and why it often does not work in the long term. Now, maintenance work, if you've done the bigger work and your body's already in a good enough spot, yeah, doing parasite cleanses a couple of times a year, yeah, that's absolutely something that we recommend. We do have a preference on company and the specific products that are used, and that there are other options out there, but we want to make sure that the body's in a good enough spot going into this that we're not going to do more harm than good. And we're also not just addressing the gut when it comes to this, because especially with parasites, they are not just localized to our gut, they are systemic throughout our entire body. And we need to make sure that we're addressing not only our gut, but also the systemic piece of this, which is a big reason why we like to use a lot of the killing products that Cellcore Biosciences uses, because they have some that are specific to the gut and they have some that are systemic, which is really valuable. You can also low dose and high dose them, and their standard dosages for a lot of these products is okay and also not effective for a lot of people, especially when it comes to parasite work. So those are some things that can happen, as to why and how, and some things to think about when it comes to yeast and fungal and then parasite issues specifically. When it comes to parasite symptoms, once again, I'll kind of run through a list here. Some of these are pretty broad spectrum and can be a variety of things. Some are pretty specific to parasites here. So all kinds of gut issues, gas, bloating, constipation, diarrhea, food sensitivities, acid reflux, heartburn, H. pylori, SIBO, yeast, and fungal issues can all be, from a root cause perspective, parasites can be playing a huge role here. Sleep issues can be huge. Food sensitivities, food cravings, and bloating, specifically if it's not terrible during the day but gets pretty bad at night, this is a huge sign with parasites. Parasites are more awake, we'll say, quote unquote, awake, more active. They are more active during later in the day, in the evening time, and overnight. So we'll often see sleep disturbances, people with very, very vivid dreams. Often parasites are playing a role. We might see a bunch of like eye crusties when someone wakes up. Eye floaters is super common and parasite related. We may see exacerbated sleep issues and anxieties right around the full moon. There's a lot of science to back this up. By the way, it's not just woo-woo. It's, and I know I've talked about this before, but when the full moon is, and it's really because of the light that the full moon brings, not necessarily the full moon just by itself, but our melatonin naturally drops, which is why some people just naturally sleep worse around the full moon. It's just the amount of light that is present, and that naturally just drops our melatonin levels. And then when our melatonin levels drop, our serotonin levels increase. And parasites also have serotonin receptors. So it's really the increase in serotonin that is contributing to this increase in parasite activity when it comes to right around the full moon here. So we might see exacerbated symptoms. Anxiety, depression, not uncommon. Like I said, hormonal imbalances, hormonal issues, especially PCOS and or endometriosis, not uncommon. You can have rashes, autoimmune diseases. Sometimes we'll get like eczema type patches that actually aren't eczema when we do a deeper dive into it. They are directly parasite related. And they almost look like dry patches. There's specific ones that if you do a quick Google search, just be careful and make sure you're in a good spot to be able to handle these images here. But, ringworm in particular has very specific patches that will pop up. People might get rashes, might get hives, histamine type issues, allergies, headaches, migraines. All of that is not uncommon with parasite overgrowth issues. So, when we look at all of this, we need to look at bigger root causes. And I'll say anyone with any of those kind of chronic yeast and fungal issues, if someone comes to me with those, the number one thing we need to do is rule mold in and out. For people with mold illness and mold toxicity, and what this really means is that you've been exposed environmentally, not food related, unless you are actively eating incredibly moldy food all of the time, which I've never seen this. Peanuts, coffee, none of this is going to contribute to actual mold illness or mold toxicity. You might not feel good if you eat something super moldy, and it can make your symptoms worse, and you may have food reactions to some of these things. And food alone is not going to cause mold illness or mold toxicity. It is always environmental. This might be a previous home. This might be a current home. This might be a workplace. It might be a previous workplace. It might be a place that you've just spent a lot of time in. any or all of those is possible. This is why we do, typically, if we see someone come to us and they're positive for mold illness or mold toxicity, we're going to recommend some sort of environmental testing. This is often going to look like an ERMI. Feel free to reference back to we did a 3-part mold episode where we do a deeper dive into that. I also have a mold, histamine, and mast cell masterclass that I did, and I do touch on this as well in that. It's $11. I'll put it in the show notes so that you have access to that and can check that out. And it's 2 hours full of all kinds of content, education, resources, and an actual, I put in some real life protocols that we use within our practice to help people heal from mold. So I will make sure that we put a link to that in the show notes if you are interested in that, and it's only $11 to get that 2-hour masterclass for you. So we need to look at all of these things. And once again, so with mold, if someone has mold issues, I can almost guarantee, and I actually, I say with 98% certainty, I've never seen this not be the case with mold, if I'm being really honest. And I'm sure it is possible. But when we are dealing with mold, mold feeds yeast and fungal overgrowth issues. That is just what happens. And there is some overlap in here. And if we look at the organic acids test, and once again, in this mold masterclass that I did, I actually go through a real life example of a sample client. And this was a real client of ours. And I go through her organic acids test. And one of the big sections that I always look at is the very first section on the organic acids test. This is the one for Mosaic, by the way. These are not all created equal. That is the only one I recommend when it comes to organic acids testing. They're not good for everything, and they're the best with the organic acids test. So when it comes to this organic acids test, one of the big things, the sections we always look at when it comes to mold and looking at mold issues is the initial section that goes over yeast and fungal markers. And there is a lot of overlap oftentimes between these two. And if someone has mold issues, the chances we have yeast and fungal issues are astronomically high, which is why that if someone comes to me with known yeast and fungal issues, number one thing we need to rule in and out is mold. Because if mold is playing a role, that is the number one offender. I don't care what else is going on in the body, that is the number one offender. And that has to be addressed before anything else. Otherwise, we will not see long-term success when it comes to yeast and fungal issues specifically. I'm also going to throw in parasites here. Whether or not someone shows a parasite pattern in the differential part of the CBC, which is really the most accurate way to look at parasite issues. Stool testing is not accurate when it comes to parasite issues. Blood testing is not accurate when it comes to parasite issues. Please keep that in mind. Those two tests are not very accurate. Looking at the differential part of the CBC is the most accurate. It is also not 100% accurate, by the way. I've seen people come to me with very mild or even what I would consider subclinical parasite patterns where we started doing parasite work, and holy moly, were parasites a massive, massive, massive issue. I've also seen this be the limiting factor in someone's healing. I'll tell you, I'm working with someone right now who she has been in this space for a decade. She's made a lot of progress, a lot of growth. I've been working with her not so much in the functional medicine capacity, more in the movement capacity for, gosh, at least 5 or 6 years at this point. But the number of practitioners she's seen is astronomical. The number of yeast and fungal protocols she's done is astronomical. And we are finally doing some different kind of work around the mold. But really, which she handled quite well, is handling quite well. But when it came to the parasite stuff, this is really, no one had ever done any sort of parasite work with her. And man, there was a lot of sensitivities. When we first started working with her, she passed a parasite. She saw it come out. It was dead. That is a trauma in and of itself sometimes for most of us. The first time you see one come out and you're like, whew. Not fun. By the way, not everyone sees parasites come out of their body, and it's a wild show if you do. I've seen, not to be too graphic, but I've seen chunks come out of me. I mean, like clumps of parasites, clumps of worms, and worms are not the only parasites. By the way, liver flukes is another really common one. I started seeing those very early on in my own healing journey when I started actually doing proper parasite work and really doing some deeper work within the liver specifically. And man, this has shifted things. We're still very early on in the process of doing this parasite work, and she is noticing big shifts and big changes that she hasn't seen in a very long time. And I can tell you, this is not uncommon. The number of people we've worked with who have come to us from years and years and years of working with other practitioners who've never done this bigger, deeper parasite work, especially systemic parasite work, I mean, just blows my mind at this point because it can make such a big difference. And this is such a massive, massive, massive contributor to chronic health issues. So when it comes to mold, mold feeds parasites. Parasites love all of these toxins, especially mold. And once again, whether parasites are dying through killing protocols, through their natural life cycles, they're releasing more mold back into the body. So if we've got mold, you have to do parasite work. For me, it is a non-negotiable, and it blows my mind that quote unquote mold literate practitioners are not doing more parasite work, especially systemic parasite work, because of this fact that when parasites die, they're going to release everything that they've been holding on to. And we know that parasites feed off of mold. So this is a huge thing that we have to do. And within our practice, we actually do systemic parasite and usually our first, sometimes our only mold binder at the same time. And it's for this very reason that we know that the parasites are going to release more mold into the body, and we really want to try and get as much mold out of the body in this one round as possible, and it is highly effective. For some people, this is the only time we have to use a very mold-specific binder, and we typically will use a fulvic and humic acid for this. Once again, this is a systemic binder. Many binders like charcoal, clay are very specific to the gut, and toxins don't just live in our gut. They live systemically throughout our entire body. And working on systemic binding is really important and really valuable as part of the healing process, especially when it comes to mold and heavy metals. We can say default to all toxins in general, including environmental toxins. And the reason I kind of lump mold and heavy metals together is because those two are known to cross the blood-brain barrier, can get into our brain. Moldy brain is a real thing. A lot of cognitive issues are actually toxin related. A lot of people that we work with who come to us haven't been diagnosed with ADD or ADHD as an adult, sometimes as kids, but more often than not as an adult. Once we do specific toxin work and work on really draining the brain and binding up toxins systemically, whatever that is for them and their bodies specifically, a lot of times we'll see those symptoms just go away completely. And it really wasn't ADD or ADHD. Now, yes, that is a real thing. And I do think a lot of people are misdiagnosed. And really, it's just they've got a lot of toxins in their brain and it's impairing their cognitive function, which we'll see very similar symptoms sometimes when we've got significant toxin overload issues. And this is something that I experienced personally. I said, look, I do not have ADD. I do not have ADHD. And it feels like I do. Felt like I did for a good period of time. And it really went away as soon as I did some really good toxin work and parasite work and really started in my deeper healing work that I did, that I noticed a significant shift in that. So this is why, so mold, yeast and fungal issues, and then parasites. So we almost have to do all of this all together. And typically how we kind of start with this process is, and once again, I go into a little bit deeper into this on that masterclass, but we've got to do prep work. Any type of work we do, before we do any killing work, before we do a bunch of binding work, we've got to make sure our pathways are open. So we do some drainage pathway support work first, potentially some mitochondrial support work to make sure our body can handle some of the bigger work that we're going to do. Looks a little different for everyone. I've got a protocol up in Fullscript. It's not one that we use. We do prefer some of the software products to assist in some of this work oftentimes. Once again, Cellcore is one of the few places where not only are their binders systemic, so it's not just localized to the gut. Once again, toxins not exclusive to the gut. They can travel throughout their entire body, but also they are selective binders, which are pretty hard to find on the market here. meaning that they don't bind up anything and everything. They're very specific in what they target and what they bind up, so that we can take them with food, we can take them with supplements, we can take them, we can take them with things without the fear of they're just going to bind up anything and everything, versus a lot of these other ones like a charcoal or clay, things like that, which you have to take away from everything because they will bind up everything. They do not distinguish in what they bind up. And this is also something we don't want to take those types of binders long term, because we can end up with a lot of nutrient deficiencies because they are going to bind up some of those. Versus some of these selective binders, we can take them longer term if we feel the need to. And I don't think everyone needs to, by the way, but we can if we need to, because they're safe, because they're only binding up certain things and they're not binding up anything and everything. So after we've done some drainage support work, basically prep work, then we can move into kind of ramping up the binder a little bit. A fulvic and humic acid, like a very concentrated version of it, can be very intense starting off with. So we like to work our way up to that. And even when we do incorporate that, we start at tiny, like microscopic dosages of it, because we've seen the side effects that people can have even at very low dosages. So, we go teeny tiny microscopic dosages when we first start. And some people do really well. Some people, we have to take it really, really, really slow. And maybe we're doing like the smallest little pinch over the course of a day or even a couple days even. And it just kind of depends on the person. But the prep work limits a lot of these reactions that many people have. So once we do the prep work, then we get into stepping up the binder. We like to do some more advanced, more intensive kind of drainage support work. We also like to start doing some brain drainage, especially people with mold and heavy metal issues, because that's a really big thing. Anyone with cognitive issues, this can be really, really, really valuable. And then we like to start doing some gut work. And really, when I say gut work, we're really looking at digestive tract work. We don't look just exclusively at the small and the large intestine. A lot of the products that we use work on the stomach, the small intestine, the large intestine, and really run through the entire digestive tract and help to kill things that should not be there. So we'll do a little bit of work with that before moving on to a mold binder and systemic parasite work. We do those at the same time. Now, here's really kind of where it gets a little bit more complicated. So that's a pretty standard approach. It often looks a little bit different depending on the person, but largely it's, generally speaking, along those lines that we're kind of moving through those kind of steps and phases. But after the initial mold and parasite work, then we need to check in. What is really going on? Do we need to do additional mold work? Which for some people we do, for some people we don't. And we don't know until we look at some labs. And for some people with us, we will just look at blood work. Some people, we're running at another organic acids test. Just kind of depends on the person and financial situation, because those tests aren't cheap. They're about $300 a pop. So we're very mindful of that. We're also going to look at parasite load. And so we have to have blood work to look at this. Is the parasite load low enough? And we look at labs, and we also check in on symptoms, by the way. We're not just looking at one or the other. We like to look at both all together, because this gives us the most accurate information here. So do we need to do additional mold work? Do we need to do additional parasite work? Or do we need to do additional yeast and fungal work? And for some people, we need to do all three. For some people, it's just one. For some people, it's just two. So it really, really depends on the person. But where a lot of people get stuck is they're not checking in at this stage. And this is where, mold literate, quote unquote, mold literate. Do you have a ton of experience with mold and looking at all of these pieces all together? This is also why we rarely recommend a straight up mycotoxin test. And if you are going to run one, please run the one from Vibrant Wellness. If you need access to this, reach out to us. We do have access to be able to order that. You cannot order it through Rupa, unfortunately, through our functional lab store, but we do have ways to order it. Yeah, it's incredibly expensive. You're looking at, I think it's like $550, $560, if I remember correctly. So it's not a cheap test. It's not a test you want to run a ton, ideally. For some people, we do. if they have the extra resources and finances and it's not a big deal, yeah, of course, it's great to have more information. And I don't feel like it's the most necessary information. The organic acid test gives us a picture of not only is there mold still issues going on, but what else is still going on? And once again, for people who really understand the impact of mold on the body and everything else that comes with mold, they are going to lean more towards an organic acids test, at least as part of the protocol, maybe not exclusively, but a huge piece of this. And I do think a lot of people overtest. I know some practitioners require a mycotoxin test, the one from Vibrant, require an organic acids test, and or require blood work and a gut zoomer from Vibrant Wellness. Man, I mean, you're looking at $1,500 usually on the low end for testing, just as a starting point, which I think is obnoxious and outrageous and unfeasible for most people, which is why blood work, we always start with blood work. And if we need to, we will run an organic acids test. So people are, like many of us don't have $1,500 just to throw away on testing. And that doesn't include any coaching, that doesn't include interpretation, that doesn't include supplementation, that doesn't include dietary, that doesn't include anything else. That is just straight up testing. And I just think that's aggressive for most people as a starting point because, hey, we're going to need to run some more tests at some point to keep an eye on this. And so are we spending another $1,500, maybe even more? Some people also require like $500 or $600 worth of supplements a month, which I think is also outrageous. I can't even imagine spending $200 a month on supplements at this point. And, the range I typically tell clients that work with us is 100 to 170. And that's, if we're running 170, that's going to be like a month maybe to start off with. And some of these things are going to last you a few months because we're not, it's just, it can add up so quickly and it can become really, really, really outrageous. When it comes to supplementation and if someone's trying to micromanage all of your stuff with supplementation. Anyways, it can be a whole nightmare. So that's kind of how we work with things. And that's how we really help people clear up mold issues, yeast and fungal issues, and parasite issues, and why we need to look at all of these things all together because they all feed off of each other. And if you only look at one piece of this, you're missing the bigger picture here. And this is why even people that are just like mildly trained in mold typically do not do a very good job when it comes to helping people heal from mold and stay healed from mold long term because they're not well versed in this full picture here. And that doesn't even touch on the mast cell and histamine piece that also comes along with this. And many people are not well versed in that side of things or only versed in the histamine side and not very familiar with mast cell issues and, the role of mast cell stabilizers and the fact that there are 16 different mast cell stabilizers. And by the way, quercetin, vitamin C, often don't do the job and people can't, especially sensitive people, can very much react to these things. So all of that plays a big role here. I also want to touch on as kind of like a last piece here. So we often get a lot of questions on stool testing, especially when it comes to parasite and yeast issues, yeast and fungal issues, candida stuff. And I do want to clarify this as well. So if you're going to run a stool test, a GI map is okay. And all of stool testing, 1. 2, if you're going to run a stool test, yeah, GMI map is okay. I do typically like a gut zoomer from Vibrant Wellness a little bit more. Yes, it is also a little bit pricier. I do think it is a little bit of a better test, and the GI map isn't bad here. But a couple of things we need to understand here, and this is largely why I don't love a stool test, especially as a starting point here. So 1, it's not very accurate when it comes to parasites. 2, it's actually not even very accurate when it comes to yeast and fungal issues. And there is a section on both for yeast and fungal issues. Now, one thing that's, once again, like if you're not very well versed in all forms of testing and you've only been trained in a stool test, you might be like, well, yeast and fungal issues will absolutely show up in stool and on stool testing. Actually, they don't. So you have to have a pretty significant yeast and fungal issue, and you have to catch it on the right day for it to show up in a stool test. If you're going to, also there are various days. Some stool tests are 1 day, some are 3. If you can get a 3-day stool test, even better because we're going to get a little bit more information and every bowel movement is a little bit different. So valuable to have that information. But it takes a while for yeast and fungal issues to show up. on a stool test. So for me, when I do see someone come in with a stool test already and I see some yeast and fungal issues, even if they're mild, it is a massive red flag for me because I know it takes a while for those issues to show up on a stool test. I know they show up in urine a whole lot faster, which once again, this is why I like the organic acids test. If we do have known issues with yeast and fungal overgrowth type issues, that is my preferred test because we're going to get a better scope. We're looking at 9 different markers for yeast and fungal issues alone. And we're also need to look at the mold. Plus, we're getting a whole bunch of other information. It's 77 markers, just by the way, on the organic acid test. So we get a ton of information that's really, really helpful and really valuable. So the stool testing is very limited. It looks at bacterial issues and good and bad, which is valuable. And if I'm being really honest, we can see if there's a bacterial issue in your blood work. Like if there's a bacterial issue, yeah, we got to address it. And bacterial issues are a symptom. They're not a root cause. And just looking at your bacterial flora, good and bad, once again, like helpful, yeah, and does not give us a very full picture. So if we're going to spend $200 to $400 on a functional lab test, my recommendation for someone starting out is absolutely not going to be a stool test. It does give us some information on the immune system, which once again, we get a good amount of information on the immune system and the gut if you know how to properly read a CBC with differential and other, that's the main one. But there's also some other blood work markers that show us some insight into some other things that can impact the gut. It also shows us bigger picture, what could also be impacting the gut as to why there are gut issues. Because if we only look at the gut, we're missing the bigger picture. Okay, how and why did these things get here in the first place? So that's why I'm not a big fan of stool testing, especially when it comes to yeast and fungal issues and parasite issues, and why the organic acid test is often a better test, especially for yeast and fungal issues. Blood work for parasites, for mold, that organic acid test is really valuable. We also can see a lot of markers in blood work, specifically around, we'll look at liver function, we'll look at blood sugar regulation, and we'll often see pretty weird blood sugar issues going on when someone has mold issues. We also see some weird cholesterol markers, and that can look high, that can look low, that can be a little just weird, odd, just numbers all over the place that don't really match up. Same thing like cholesterol markers and overall metabolic health looking very, very odd and maybe not corresponding with what someone's nutrition and lifestyle really looks like. And that's often an indication that we might have some mold issues. So, and obviously symptoms give us a whole lot along with health history. So all of that is really, really, really important. So I just wanted to provide some additional education around this. If you think you are struggling with mold, I cannot recommend working with a very well qualified mold practitioner. If that's us, if that's someone else, we do have a very high success rate when it comes to helping people heal from mold, over 95%, and helping people fully heal from mold. And most of that 5% that we don't help are people that leave our program early and we don't have just enough time to finish doing the work that we need to do. And that's often the case for that 5%. But yeah, if you need help, we're always here. You're always welcome to ask questions. Thank you for listening. As always, please like, subscribe, follow. If it resonates, 5-star reviews really, really, really mean the world to us. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.